So we've been talking about all of these different situations that surround us. When we look at the current situation in Libya, Mustafa Abu Sharour, and you served as the first deputy prime minister of the country between 2011 and 2012, there still seems to be quite a blatant level of political and military chaos within the country. What will it take for the Libyans to be able to shake off what seems to be, in many respects, the legacy of foreign intervention, NATO's military intervention, and for the purpose of regime change all these many years ago? You've got warring factions now awash with weapons and regional support from different players vying for power. What will it take to really gain some level of political reconciliation?
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. Of course, Libya has facing very serious issues and problems. We deal with the legacy of dictatorship that extended for more than 40 years. We are with the legacy of intervention from huge number of countries who they have conflicting interests in the country itself. And also at the same time, we have a war that is going on as we speak on the gates of Tripoli. Because clearly the powers in the world, who they are, putting their hands and mingling in Libya, they would like to see a dictatorship to rule in our parts of the world, because that's much easier to deal with. It is very easy to get to whatever they want. So now we have all these issues that we are facing at the same time. There have been many attempts of resolving these issues politically, but every time somehow they collapse. Clearly, if we look at the current situation, is there a way out from where we are? I think one of the major issues that the determination of the Libyan people themselves, that they are not going to go back to the rule of one man, the military rule, the dictatorship. This is something that they have clearly committed themselves. They have to get out from it since the beginning of the revolution. So this is really, I would say, is the major hope that we have in Libya is that part.
Sure, but can they survive with the rule of two men? Currently, you've got two men vying for power.
Yes.
Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army and Faiza Sarraj's government of national accord. And as you say, each one backed by quite powerful regional forces.
Yes, but of course, if you look at these two people, they really don't have much of a support from the people themselves. They have support from very limited powers, either from the outside or not. But I think it is the Battle of Tripoli, if I will call it, it's going to determine part of that future. And the Battle of Tripoli clearly will lead to the defeat of the military solution that some countries have pushed forward. But how are we going to do that?
But I do have to ask you very quickly before moving on about that military solution as opposed to the political solution. We just heard on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, both the Italians and the French come out and say there must absolutely be a political solution. It almost sounds a little bit ironic that they are saying this, having played such an important role in the military intervention of NATO in the first place.
Yes.
But so is that possible? Will countries stop providing the weapons that each one of those two players are using?
No, I think what makes this war to continue is the continuous support of Khalifa Haftar by the French, by the Emiratis, by the Egyptians, and so on. If that support will stop, this war will stop right away, because he doesn't have the means to be able to continue this war.
Of course.
So that's really what makes difference. And of course, it's very important, as you said, there is the French coming out and saying it clearly, there is no military solution. And also there is the movement in the United States Congress, which also they're coming with a policy to see how you're going to strategy for ending the struggle in Libya.
But of course, the other side will also say that they want to see the end of militias and they want to see the end of support that Qatar, Turkey, and others have been giving the other side as well. But we'll come back to the case of Libya. If I can perhaps move on to Cevdet Yilmaz, Chairman of Foreign Affairs of the AK Party, and talk about, well, the issue of the moment. Turkey's relations with the European Union, the United States, the Arab world has been dramatically strained by the operation that Turkey launched a few days ago in northern Syria. Of course, the clock is ticking, and we shall see the outcome of the pause between both sides. But even the United Nations, to my mind, hasn't been supportive of this operation. How do you respond to all the criticisms that Turkey has faced? Did Ankara expect to see this sort of backlash?
Thank you very much. Actually, we have seen a great instability in our region, especially in Syria, and a big humanitarian disaster for years. For 8 years almost, we have seen very big humanitarian disasters, catastrophic actions by the regime itself, by many other foreign powers coming from far away to this part of the world, and with proxy elements on the ground. And most of the cost has been borne by the regional countries, and foremost by Turkey, actually. Currently, we are hosting around 5 million refugees in Turkey, and 3 million, more than 3.6 million is from Syria, actually. And they are coming from Syria, from different parts of Syria, Arabs, Kurds, Turkmens. We didn't look at their ethnicity or their sex or their ideologies, actually. We just helped them to save their lives from this brutal situation. And Turkey has done a lot on this. The Western friends, our Western friends, Europeans and US, they paid lip service to this situation. They actually thanked Turkey for hosting such a big population with so long, actually. But they didn't do anything concrete on the ground. On the contrary, this situation has deteriorated with Daesh, with other terrorist organizations like PKK, branch of PKK, PYD, and US actually has directly financed and provided weapons to this terrorist organization to fight with another terrorist organization, Daesh. From the very beginning, Turkey has urged that you cannot use a terrorist organization against another. You just complicate the situation. We have to fight together against all terrorist organizations without making any differentiation. Daesh does not represent Muslims, and PKK does not represent Kurds. They are terrorist organizations. They pose serious security threats to civilians in Turkey. They have committed lots of
No, but I just wanted to ask you, though, but this may be the situation, certainly viewed from here, but how do you respond to the argument being made in many capitals around the world, certainly in the Western world and in the United States, within Congress, not so much within the White House, but within Congress, that this operation may in fact lengthen the conflict in Syria, that it could create a humanitarian situation that could be worsened by this operation? I know that the purpose is, as you say, to also create that safe zone for these millions of refugees that Turkey has taken in. But some would argue that it has been driven by domestic politics from the AK party more than national security reasons. At least that is part of the argument. How do you respond to this?
I mean, I don't agree with this, of course. I mean, some of the countries that have created the real humanitarian disaster are now accusing Turkey for humanitarian effects of its operation. That is not sincere, actually. That is not true. And there are many other observers. They have, especially in international media, they are generating a very, a perception that is far away from the reality on the ground. Turkey has an interest in the stability of Syria more than any other party to this debate. Syria, a stable Syria, a united Syria, a Syria in which these differences, different ethnic groups, sectarian groups live together, is in our interest. So we are working for this, actually. We are not trying to create a humanitarian deterioration. On the contrary, we believe that this operation will also help to the political solution in Syria. In the Astana process, we worked with Russia and Iran to generate this constitutional committee, you know. It has been decided, and we believe that Turkey's actions will accelerate this political process rather than hinder it.
And so you reject the notion that this has been driven by domestic politics as well?
I mean, this is a false accusation. It has nothing to do with domestic politics. We have been long time preparing for this operation and openly declaring that we will not let these developments go on. And President Erdogan, he made several times these announcements. This is not a recent, decision. It has been in preparations for a long time, and we have negotiated with US, with others for this operation, and now we have decided to act, actually.
Thank you, Mr. Yilmaz. We'll of course come back later to something that you mentioned briefly, which is also the interesting alliance between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. But moving on to Mahaz, as head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, when you look at the growing repression in Egypt and this new wave of protests that seems to have been ignited by former military contractors with videos posted from abroad, it seems to really have caught the attention of the youth, who are also fed up with the corruption and the spending from within President Sisi's inner circle, not to mention all of the other issues that they have grievances with. You must wonder, though, was it all worth it? Is Egypt today better off than it was before President Hosni Mubarak was toppled?
I mean, clearly Egypt struggled like that of the region.
Okay.
Clearly Egypt's struggle, like that of others in the region, is a long-term one. We cannot say that today Egypt is worse off from a previous dictator or better off. Egypt has suffered from decades of dictatorship. It has suffered from dictatorship since 1952. And the people rose at different times through these decades. And the greatest manifestation of that was in 2011, and the free and fair elections that brought to power the first democratically elected president of Egypt, Dr. Mohamed Morsi, the late Dr. Mohamed Morsi, the elected president of Egypt in 2012. The real dilemma of Egyptians is that a coup happened against their will, a military coup that has seen one of the most tyrannical regimes in Egypt's modern history. And today, what you mention in terms of protests in September are an attempt to break the barrier of fear. That barrier of fear is a protection for the regime. The regime ensures that it is so tyrannical that it creates a republic of fear so that people don't dare move. But the economic situation is so dire, the failure of the regime is so great in terms of delivering to the people, and the issue of corruption is fundamental. Now, this issue of corruption has kept elite in power, military that controls the economy, that has a stranglehold on the economy, and also a business elite from the Mubarak period that has exploited the vast majority of Egyptians. Egyptians, numbering over 100 million almost now, are the ones who are suffering. A very small percentage have gained from this regime. Its corruption, its regional alliances are part and parcel of a region that I believe regimes that feel under threat, from the Gulf, from North Africa to the Gulf. The time is against them. And I believe time is with the people of the region. The struggle is not easy, and it will take time.
Is it only that time is against them? You mentioned the attempts to break what you call the barrier of fear. They've got more than just time against them, it seems. They've got the US's close embrace of the Sisi regime. They've got the military, which seems to be in strong control of not just the government, but the economy of the country. Given the tens of thousands of people, according to human rights organizations, who've been detained, the political dissenters and the protesters, where could this new movement lead? How much time will it take?
The cracks are beginning to show. The cracks are there. there is a limit to how long a military regime can keep its tanks on the streets every time a small number of people emerge on the streets. It's got to deliver. It's got to feed the mouths, the hungry mouths of millions of people. Egypt today, the vast majority of Egyptians live under the poverty line. This is according to the World Bank and even according to Egyptian statistics themselves. The vast majority of Egyptians, about 60%, live under the poverty line. The regime, with its corruption, cannot deliver because it's a structural issue. The issue is not just politics, of course it is. We have over 60,000 political prisoners. People are rounded up, whatever their political orientation. Journalists are rounded up if they visit from other countries. It is truly a regime that is tyrannical, one of the most despotic in the region, and yet it's still got to provide economically. It can't do that if it wants to maintain support of an elite that is used to corruption.
All right, thank you very much, Mahazam. For now, let me move on to Professor Burhanuddin Duran. And again, talk about Turkey. Turkey as an important regional power. How will its complicated relationship with the United States and its alliance with Russia and Iran shape its role within the region?
Well, first of all, I want to underline the reality that this Syrian civil war, which has not been solved by a comprehensive solution in the last 8 years, is a great challenge not only to Turkey but also to all of the regional powers. But of course, for Turkey, this Syrian civil war has constituted multidimensional challenges, ranging from foreign fighters, terrorists like YPG, Daesh, and refugees. 3.6 million Syrian refugees are living in Turkey. Maybe in Idlib the same number of refugees are waiting for flow of human tragedy. So, and again, the YPG threat is detrimental to Turkey's territorial integrity. Having said this, all of these challenges coming from Syrian civil war, of course, Turkey is trying to do her best. Since 2016, Turkey is conducting 3 incursions into Syrian lands. The last one is Operation Peace Spring. All of them are directed to, of course, keep Syrian territorial integrity, but to fight with Daesh and YPG terrorism. And recently, President Erdogan actually proposed a safe zone to make a solution to the Syrian refugee problem, and at the same time to secure Turkey's borders from YPG terrorism. We know that this plan is the only plan on the table. There is no other peace solution. Turkey is trying to work with Russia and Iran through Astana process to make this Astana process as a part of Geneva process. You know, there is no other way to have a political transition process in Syria. Of course, all of these relations are handled by President Erdogan through diplomacies face-to-face with leaders. But this is not an easy process because we are witnessing the main repercussions of the so-called the collapse of the liberal world order in the Middle East. There is an interaction between this shifting realities at the global level with the regional turmoil. There is polarization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and all of the negative effects of the post-Arab Spring period are there. So it's not easy to handle all of these negative consequences for Turkey at the level of Syria.
Let me ask you if I can, and I apologize for interjecting, but you mentioned the shifting dynamics and there are certainly plenty, shifting alliances too. What about the geostrategic priorities that may or may not be shifting when it comes to Turkey and its membership in NATO? How robust, how central does that remain for Turkey? There were voices within the US Congress asking, quite surprisingly, for NATO to suspend the membership of Turkey. But I ask you as well, does Turkey appear to be hedging its bets? Does it have a foot already out of NATO with its purchase of the S-400 Russian defense system? Or is it still looking at NATO as a robust partner along the southern flank?
Well, I'm trying to say that, the Syrian civil war was so detrimental to Turkish interests. And Turkey is trying to her best to secure interest and to face the challenges coming from the shifts in the geopolitical arena. What are they? To fight with terrorism, Syrian refugees, and there are non-state actors, failed states in the region, and polarization, and you have to face all of them at the same time. And Turkey is trying to do that.
Okay.
But nevertheless, unfortunately, NATO allies are not helping enough. Europeans are not doing enough, for example, for refugees or foreign fighters. And Turkey is suffering a lot, and Turkey is not receiving any enough help from the US or from the European allies, from NATO allies. So if you are in a place of self-help, and if you are in a place of even working with Russia and other regional powers to secure your borders, to secure your interests, yes, you may be criticized. But who are the positively contributors to the Syrian civil war? Just look at the refugees, just look at the fight with terrorism. Turkey is the first among the powers that are contributing to solution. So there's all these debates on NATO suspension of membership. These are the just fluctuations of power relations to have a new equilibrium in the Middle East and in relations with Turkey. And I believe that all of them will be ineffective regarding Turkey's integration with the Western Bloc.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Duran. Rasool Serdar Attash, what about the role of the media, the traditional media in the region, driving the coverage of events, and social media as well, which is increasingly looked at least from within the youth segments of societies across the Arab world, as perhaps a more dependable, more objective medium? Is it fair to say that today all networks in the Middle East have a horse in any given race?
Well, for the media, the problem is a very much structural, chronicle problem now, because media traditionally, during the Cold War, was settling its down based on a bipolar world order. But now, while everything is being that much bubbling and so quickly processing in the region, interestingly, the media could not avoid itself from the lure of the social media. So traditional, conventional media has only two of the advantages over the social media. One of them is the accuracy, and the other one is the in-depth. So in terms of the breaking news, for the conventional, traditional media, it's almost impossible to conduct or to be a part of a fair competition. The problem with the social media is the lack of the confirmation process. But unfortunately, the traditional media now is trying to act like social media. So likely now the member of the traditional medias are acting as activists, and our traditional newsrooms are becoming more and more like the social media centers. So the lack of accountability is one of the chronicle problems that we are facing every day, and the lack of accountability, the confirmation process is not working, and the lack of in-depth knowledge regarding to the region. You will see that many of journalists in many of the newsrooms, international outlets, will justify sometimes their lack of in-depth knowledge regarding to a certain conflict, or particularly MENA, will say we need a fresh look. Whenever I hear that fresh look, it's a little bit scares me, because fresh looks mean the lack of in-depth knowledge. It's the only justification for many of, especially those who are coming from the Western media industry. I think now our traditional newsrooms are not definitely ready for that much of a shaken region to confront it and to cover it. Just to go through a kind of summarization of the region, what's happening now in our region, and whether our newsrooms or the media is really responding that properly or not. Just thinking of that, 9 years ago, 7 years ago, it was very much popular for the global powers to finance and to support the non-state actors, so to conduct their proxy wars. And now, particularly by the withdrawal of the US troops in the northern of the Syria, you will see that the superpowers, or let's say global order, is coming back to the traditional diplomacy and investing in the state actors again. So what will happen to these non-state actors in the region, and what will be the response of the media to that? On the other hand, are we really going to through a post-American Middle East, or it is like going to be a new area of the multiplayer Middle East, like Russia, Turkey, Iran, the rise of the regional powers, and even to a certain extent, maybe some of the European countries? How the media is going to deal with this kind of the new area of the rising of the regional powers and the post-American Middle East? And how is going to decouple MENA region with the traditional Middle East region? Even how is going to decouple the conflict zones with the Gulf? So, and how the media is going to respond to the post-Arab Spring. So while these non-state actors, some of them are going to be the part of the central governments, some of them are going to leave their identity policies and demilitarization of these non-state actors. So how the newsrooms are going to respond to that?
But so how much of a double-edged sword is it? I mean, could it potentially be an enemy of democracy? I mean, even though everyone has access to social media, it is also prone to gross manipulation and subversion. And we saw in the case of the US election in 2016, if that could happen there with all the hacking and all the manipulation, you could imagine it could happen anywhere in the world. How do you deal with this sort of thing moving forward?
That is true. When I say lack of the confirmation, is that most probably if Twitter was around recently, I'm reading just that a funny piece on social media. If Twitter was around when France got out of the NATO's military wing and expelled the American troops on its territory, most probably that could lead even to a war. It could be even the collapse of NATO as a total. So now when you look at all of that, the problem, the structural problem with the academics and with the policymakers, that the information is coming from a source that's not reliable, it is a kind of ocean of the disinformation. The newsrooms now, the global newsrooms and the policymakers, unfortunately, are being informed, and the flow of disinformation is coming from the unconfirmed sources like the social media and so on, and the decision is being made based on that. I think one of the key questions for the social media ahead of us is going to be how to settle the proper confirmation process for the social media in that sense, especially when it comes to the countries to produce the new policies regarding some particular issues.
Thank you very much, Rasool Serdar Attash. Salman Sheikh, last but not least, let me come to you. When you look at the lay of the land today, the Middle East, take your pick, the Gulf region, of course, as well, and I know you lived for a few years in Doha, Qatar. All the shifting alliances, Israel and the Gulf states on the one side, you've got Iran on the other, Egypt in many respects enabling, in fact, implementing the blockade on Gaza, and that's been going on for years. Are we seeing the beginning of, quote, a grand new diplomatic structure? Or is it just another illusion, as Martin Indyk, who I believe is your former boss, recently wrote in Foreign Affairs?
Well, thank you very much, and I must say thank you for the invitation by the organizers in what is one of the best forums and best organized forums I've been to. Look, we have to start with, as you just said, the broader picture. And what is clear here is that the American era in the Middle East region, more broadly, is coming to an end. This is not just the unpredictability of President Trump. It is actually a trend which we have seen. You can take a starting point, the mistake of invading Iraq in 2003 by Bush. You can take Obama's precipitous withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. You could take the red line when it came to the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, or you could take northeast Syria today. The question is, as has been said, in a more multipolar world, do we have chaos, competition, or can we find cooperation? And that is very much something which is a challenge for the regional states, and it is a challenge, of course, for the global powers. We ourselves have been running various dialogues with global power representatives, for example. And it's clear that there is a real danger that geopolitical rivalries will further exacerbate the regional challenges that we have. And here, Syria is a cautionary tale. It was the inability of the international community to support what were peaceful cross-confessional protests, rather like we are seeing in Lebanon today, or we saw in Sudan, or we've seen elsewhere. It was its inability to do its job in trying to enforce international law and international standards which set this off. But then we have now seen a struggle in terms of the broader positioning of these states. And this is where Russia, of course, has emerged. As we speak, I believe President Erdogan is arriving in Sochi. He'll go into his tete-a-tete lunch with President Putin in order to discuss these weighty matters of what happens in Syria going forward. Final thing I will say here, though, Tunisia tells us, Sudan tells us, that if there is not a homegrown effort which is organized, it's one thing to break the security state of the Arab security state. It's another to try to find ways to forge it. And I commend Tunisia for what it has done. I commend the people of Sudan. And I hope those lessons of finding homegrown processes supported by the international community in terms of doing its job when it comes to extreme violence is the way forward.
And when you think of the way forward, you did mention the US policy toward the region, and you took it back a few years and an administration or two back. It hasn't all begun under Trump, even though a lot of people will say and have written that in fact it is his, what they call his failed policies that have led the region increasingly towards where it's going. But in an ironic way, do you think that President Trump's clarity, at least, on the Middle East peace process, the fact that he has undermined the process once and for all, could it actually serve as a positive as we move forward, in that no one is any longer, not the Palestinian Authority, no one else is going to be hiding under the cloak of this so-called process?
No, you're absolutely right. The United States currently is not an honest broker when it comes to the Middle East peace process. Many would say, in fact, structurally, the United States with its own domestic politics could never have been an honest broker when it came to the Middle East process. And as you know, I was very much working for one of the UN Middle East peace envoys at the time of Yasser Arafat and the Middle East roadmap and all the rest of it. That was still seen as the heady days of trying, the post-Oslo, trying to make peace. Going forward today, the responsibility does lie with Palestinian and Israeli leaders, first and foremost, especially if they are to make this the number one issue again in the region. My own personal view is that we need a change of leadership on both camps in order to forge those kinds of compromises. But it may be, I am a great advocate of the two-state solution, it may be that we have moved beyond that in this respect. I would say also, when you mentioned the Gulf, and now going back to President Trump, I was in Abu Dhabi last week. It's quite clear that the region has realized that that security umbrella which the Americans were providing together with Western allies is not to be taken for granted anymore. That is why, of course, we have building relationships with Russia and with China, with India, and with other global powers, but that is why also Abu Dhabi is now speaking to Tehran. Even Saudi Arabia has probably got some level of informal discussions. We've even seen that in op-eds which have been written by prominent Saudis in this respect. So it is for the region to try to find this way. It is for the global powers not to make things more complicated. We have to find a regional and international compact which will take us forward when it comes to Iran. And here, in my view, it is the phrase of mutual security, mutual respect, which has to be built upon. If we are able to start on that path, then maybe the region will start to play the kind of role it needs to in peacemaking.
Thank you very much, Salman Sheikh. Coming back to you, Mr. Abu Sharour, Salman Sheikh just mentioned the issue of global powers and the role that they play in providing security, or quite the opposite in some instances. When I look at Libya, the current situation there, and the chaos, really, that you see, you've got an international conference in Berlin that was supposed to take place this month that has now been postponed indefinitely. There was never going to be any Libyan representation, though. Can you see the region beginning to even try to solve its own affairs when it is not at the table? There was going to be the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus, I believe, Germany and Italy, but no Libyans.
Yeah, that's the irony of the situation, that we're a conference about Libya without no Libyan representation. Because this is clearly an insult to the Libyan people themselves. And also it's clearly the way how they are looking at this whole thing, and clearly they are not interested. I mean, I will put it this way, they are not interested to see a solution to the Libyan problem. I mean, clearly it is always going to fall on the Libyans themselves to find a solution for their problem. Of course, the influence of the regional countries, which really is messing up the whole situation, that's what's affecting it. The other part is that the United Nations mission to Libya, it has been so ineffective throughout the years, because we end up every time that the representative of the General Secretary, he has some ties with the countries which they are messing up the situation in Libya. And so you have a UN mission that is not really impartial. It is clearly works for one of the countries which are influencing the situation in Libya itself.
I'm tempted to ask you which ones.
Of course, it is the DOE, United Arab Emirates. We have seen what Mr. Leon has, the association, and also Mr. Ghassan Salama Association, and so on with that. But that's clearly to be able to solve the problem in Libya. You have, as long as the international community, the United Nations, is failing even to stop the flow of arms in the country, especially from those who they are supporting Khalifa Haftar, and also the flow of mercenaries and arms. Of course, people always, they talk about there is a proxy war in Libya between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi and Egypt on one side, and the Qatar and Turkey on the other side, which is not really true, because there is no arms coming from Qatar to Libya. There is no Qatari soldiers in Libya. There is no Turkish soldiers fighting in Libya, while there are on the other side. And so it is clearly to be able to do that. And also we have a serious problem with the current institutions in Libya themselves.
I just want to say that there is quite significant support, though.
Yes. Yeah, there is support, but there is no, it's a very different type of support that is there. But also we have an issue with the current institutions in Libya. You have a presidential council that really has ended up being a one-man show. The House of Representatives has no positive effect, but even has a negative effect, and also right now it has been elected for 18 months. Right now they are being in place for 5 years. You have another institution which called now the State Council. So I think it's a solution to move forward. First of all, the United Nations and the international community, since clearly they are the one who helped the Libyan revolution itself, they have to assume this role of being able to support a real change in Libya. And the real change can happen, first of all these institutions, they have no legitimacy whatsoever. And that means you have to come up with other ways of coming up with a way of a transitional period where you'll be able to stop the war, move on to new election and hopefully new institutions.
But with no central authority, you wonder how this can happen. And I just want to ask you very briefly about, since you mentioned institutions and the like, the Libyan National Coast Guard, which many people would consider is essentially doing the bidding, the dirty work, in other words, of the European Union. It has an agreement worth millions of dollars with the EU to intercept African migrants at sea in the Mediterranean, trying to reach the shores of Italy and to go on to Europe. But these people are being detained in terrible conditions. Human rights organizations have said so much, with sexual exploitation, forced labor, serious abuses. Is that a situation that is tenable and acceptable?
No, it is not acceptable. Clearly, if you are in Libya and you look at this issue there, it's a very serious problem for the Libyans themselves, because you have a flood of tens of thousands of people who really they're using Libya as a conduit to go to Europe. But of course they find themselves stuck in the country. So they are coming and they need to work, so they are committing crimes, they're bringing diseases. So really it is a very serious issue for the Libyans. But of course that's another byproduct of the current situation that we are in. And so in order to be able to move out from this, clearly there have to be a mechanism where you have to look at the problem seriously, freshly, to how to handle this. First of all, there have to be a very serious position from the United Nations to stop the flow of arms in the country, the intervention from those countries so they are there. Now, of course, the situation in the world has been changed over the last several months, which I think this can become possible to do that. Clearly, we know that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they have their own serious issues at these days that have arisen from the Yemen intervention and from, of course, the attacks that the Houthis have against the Saudis, and also the threat to the Emiratis themselves. Yeah. So clearly they have a serious problem at their hands. So, and also at the same time, the international support that they are getting from France and others is deteriorating, is becoming weaker. So that means the position in the next near future going to change. But of course, it is always on the Libyans themselves have to become with the initiative to be able to see how can they save their country.
Okay, turning to you again, Mr. Yilmaz, how much is it on the region itself to solve some of the issues, specifically to do with the instability created by Syria? As Salman Sheikh mentioned, President Erdogan is on his way to Sochi, meeting with Vladimir Putin. To what extent will any solution have to be pragmatic? How much will each side have to make certain concessions to create that stability?
Actually, neither stability nor democracy nor development are imported goods. You have to generate it locally, in your own region, in your own country. I mean, we have seen what happened in Iraq, in other parts of the world, when some powers claimed that they will bring democracy or development. We have to be working on the ground with regional actors, actually, and we have to be very realistic. We shouldn't look for theoretical and romantical solutions. We have to be very practical, very realistic to resolve problems. And otherwise, we cannot progress. We have seen this in Idlib, for example. Turkey worked with Iran and Russia and President Erdogan made a leadership and generated a concrete result. And millions of people have benefited from this. We call it humanitarian diplomacy indeed, and also very realistic diplomacy. We are not moving with some prejudices or preconditions. We are just looking to the concrete situation and working with the real actors on the ground. I believe this is also a model for other problems in our region. We have to focus on our internal debate. There should be more dialogue in localities, in nations, and also region-wide. We have to look for solutions for ourselves. Of course, when there is some international favorable environment, that would also be okay. But the real solution will come from the local level, from national level and regional level. And we have to engage with each other. We shouldn't prefer to talk to faraway countries and neglect to talk to our neighbors, actually. So that is how we are approaching the situation.
But isn't that part of the reality, though? That it is also those faraway nations, whether it is Russia, China, or the United States, that also hold a significant part of the key.
But we have seen that they are complicating the situation. They are generating problems more than they resolving the issues. So we have to focus on regional level. And sometimes, I mean, within countries, you see different groups, they don't speak to each other, but they tolerate differences when they go abroad. That is not the right approach. We have to tolerate differences in our own environment. We have to look at solutions in a democratic environment, of course, in our own cases. And we have seen in our own experience in Turkey that democracy, development, and security go hand in hand, and they are not imported. You just have to, focus on your own internal dynamics and generate these results with your own people, with your own institutions. But of course, if there is a favorable global international environment, that would also be okay.
Well, it's interesting, Mahazam, in the case of Egypt, how do you see things? Is it fair to say that it is down to two essential factors, the United States and the military? If you have the support of one or the other, or both, you could purport to stay in power as long as you want to, no matter what the people on the streets may think.
No, I think there's been a real change. And that the military in Egypt, as other regimes in the region, face a real crisis. And that there has been some profound movements, not necessarily reflected on the grounds, but in the mentality of people in terms of how they view the military. A military in Egypt that was sacrosanct, that people believed served the people. I think there's a very different perception today that has gradually increased, not only from 2011, but particularly after the coup in 2013. The stature of the military and the fact that it serves the interests of the Egyptian people has diminished enormously. The issue, as I said earlier, takes time. The role of the United States is such that change may be forced on the United States and international players if there is change on the ground. The United States and its allies look to see what's happening in Egypt. If the balance of power changes, they will also shift. It's not a shift they like, it is a shift they will avoid. They will continue to support the dictatorships in the region. Trump clearly said that Sisi was his favorite dictator, and unfortunately that is true. That does not serve the interests of the Egyptian people, but I think we face a major shift, and that shift is that across the region, regimes are trying to hold on. They've still got a way to go, but what we're seeing is still the old battle for the independence of the region. We haven't used the word independence today, but we talk about the right for social justice, but it is also about the right of the nations of the region to make their own decisions without the interference of international states, without the interference of the elephant in the room, Israel. And that interference is continuously there. It has increased with alliances with dictatorships in the region, and that is not acceptable to the peoples of the region. The peoples of the region want social justice, but they want independence. What we're suffering from today is neocolonialism in one form or another.
Professor Duran, again, going back to Syria, but looking at the wider region as well, how pragmatic will all parties have to be, and what will a solution need to look like?
Well, pragmatism is the necessary thing to have in the Middle East nowadays. But we have to be realistic because of the facts on the grounds. Well, we have seen Washington's change of heart about its own global role, and we are witnessing the era of the end of liberal hegemony. And of course, this phenomenon has two sides in the region. One is regional powers are trying to compete with each other and trying to consolidate their interest, but at the same time, this is bringing chaos, competition, and sometimes proxies. But at the same time, we need cooperation. But the other side is creating more chaos, and this chaos is not creative, it's destructive. When the parties, even global powers, realize that this chaos in the Middle East, which is the heaviest price of the end of liberal hegemony to the region, by the way, and then they will follow their pragmatic ways. Actually, Turkey is now trying to constitute a pragmatic approach to the solution. But you cannot do this just by diplomacy or just by talking. You have to be there in Syria by your hard power. That's why Turkey made the third incursion into Syria after 2016. You know, it is Turkey that latecomer to Syria by hard power. But when will be a tendency towards more cooperation in the region? Actually, my answer is to that question is when they realize that their political ambitions or their grand strategies of designing the region in their own capacity was not something to be fulfilled, and making reverse repercussions, negative effects on their own policies, then they will come to that point. But at the same time, we need some positive help coming from global powers. US is not on the page that I mentioned, and unfortunately, Russia is not there. If they realize that they could help to make solution in Syria first, that is the test case, and then we can expect more cooperative and more orderly regional order in the Middle East. But for the short term, I'm not optimistic.
Not optimistic in the short term. Rasool Serdar Atash, at the heart of much of what we're discussing today is the human element. TRT World itself was established a few years ago at the height of the refugee crisis. To what extent does a human story like this drive the coverage today in the Middle East, and how much appetite is there among people who, in many respects, feel that they've seen it all, that they need some light entertainment in their lives to take them away, to help them escape from the misery that they see around them?
So in the, especially after the aftermath of the Arab Spring, that there has been humanitarian catastrophes and disasters going on in the region. Unfortunately, the media overall has not been a constructive force in the sense, but rather, I will say, has been a destructive one. If you look at just recently, after Turkey's operation, the Peace Spring operation over Syria, we'll see that the media, particularly American media, is calling for a constant war instead of trying to calm down the parties and the sides. So human being here, yes, definitely is the center, but if the politicization of the media, including the regional media outlets as well, get deeper and deeper, I don't see a kind of optimistic chance or opportunity that the media will contribute in a positive way to the humanitarian catastrophe and disasters that are going on in the region, because the media is very much deeply politicized now. That politicization of the media is creating a very much vital and pivotal issue for the media now. But on the other hand, we need to see that social media, on the other hand, could be a kind of driving force when it comes to the humanitarian issues. social media as a facilitator and as an initiator, but not as a healthy, fertile ground for any social transformation. So at the end of the day, media is supposed to strengthen itself, particularly among the middle class, the thinking class of the region. Now, while we are going to heading into the post-Arab Spring in the region, and while the states are reconstructing themselves, and while we are preparing for the area of non-conflict times, the role of media here, what's going to be that? So I think media as a pressure and as a driving force for the middle classes could be very much constructive in terms of restructuring these state apparatus. How are we going to secure, as journalists and as media outlets, global media outlets, how are we going to secure to create inclusive, democratic, central governments without leading the region into a second deep wave of the violence and the conflict? Because think of Syria, think of Iraq, and to a certain extent, I think it's going to come to Libya as well, and Yemen as well, most probably. These governments are going to declare a triumph over the opposition forces. So are these governments and central governments, going to try to turn back their countries into the pre-2000s, or the new constitutions or the new segments of the society are going to be included into the process of reconstructing the state? So what's going to be the role of the media here is that I think that will be the most humanitarian way. We should not mix, when we say the humanitarian approach does not mean going and putting a camera into a refugee child. That is not the humanitarian approach. The humanitarian approach, how to perform and conduct your responsible journalism when sometimes it comes to the grand picture as well. For example, the constitutions of the region, and how are we going to help the central governments to build a new model that is very much inclusive and include all the segments of the society without leading a second wave of conflicts and violence.
Obviously a huge responsibility on the shoulders of the media to present the real narrative of what's going on. Just briefly, on to you, Salman Sheikh. Looking at the situation in Yemen, which quite often goes way undercovered and under the radar when it comes to the media coverage, certainly in the West, but across the world as well. How do you briefly explain the connivance of the West, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, with Egypt on the margins in the best case scenario, in this relentless assault on Yemen?
Well, it is a shame. It is a war which should have been unwanted. It was, in many ways, for Saudi Arabia, it's been a self-inflicted wound. It came as a result of allowing certain Gulf actors to vent and to try and take matters into their own hands, again, with the retrenchment of global leadership, and particularly on the American side. But let me focus on the positive, actually, on Yemen. The Houthis are now speaking to the Saudis. There are more serious efforts going on. So again, it comes back to, in this changing environment, do we have an effort to try to build some level of cooperation or not? Can I just pick up on, I know you're short of time.
Briefly, if you would. My eyes on the clock, and then we'll go to final comments.
I see it. We talked about post-Arab Spring. Look, the world was not made in one season, and certainly the new Arab world will be made over many seasons. That's why we are seeing wave after wave of protests, and it will keep coming as long as people don't get their dignity and the opportunity and the crushing inequality that they have to live through. If that's not alleviated, it will keep coming back. In Lebanon, 3,000 individuals earn as much as the bottom 50% of that country. That's not acceptable anymore. Of course, we're seeing it in the West too. So that will continue. If we are to win the peace, and maybe I can say this at the end, the transition from conflict to peace will require a much more inclusive approach, structural changes. And in the case of Syria, it will require some ingenuity, but maybe I can speak about that.
So finally, just in half a minute, if you would, your closing thoughts on the region moving forward, how optimistic or not do you remain?
Well, let me focus on northeast Syria, because this is where we've been doing a lot of our Track 2 dialogue work. Since July 2017, we have been bringing Syrian Arabs and Syrian Kurds together from northeast Syria. And at the start of this year, we have been actually bringing together more formally parties, the Syrian Democratic Council, with those who oppose it. It is quite clear in this new changed environment, local governance, more inclusive and representative local governance, whether it's in the safe zone area or whether it's in Arab majority areas, is going to be absolutely crucial. And let me say here, to a friend in Turkey, that the initial Afrin operation was not a good example of local governance establishing itself, and for there to be the more inclusive approach. I'm confident, with the Syrian interim government playing an increasing role, that we will be able to build a more inclusive governance model there. If we're not, I'm afraid we're going to start to see the situation in northeast Syria continue to go out of control.
All right, thank you, Salman Sheikh. To you, Rasool Sardar, in a nutshell or two. Well, let me go to Professor Duran, but these will be final remarks, please. But I'll go to you first, Professor Duran.
For Turkey's efforts to create local councils in the areas that are controlled by Turkish army, Salman raised this question. Yes, there are some difficulties. We have to be realistic about that. But it is certain that there is no international cooperation to establish safe zone, settlement of refugees, even providing safety for the people. So Turkey is following a policy of first fighting with terrorists, providing safety in that zone, and then re-establishing this area by the help of establishing local councils. Without providing safety and security to that region, you cannot establish local councils, which should be, of course, inclusive. That is the time for Turkey to do that. But let's be honest that international community is not helping enough.
Thank you very much. Sardar, in a word or two, a challenging time for any journalist.
I think journalists are supposed to go back to the field. That is essentially important. And journalism still requires an in-depth knowledge. No fresh look, but in-depth knowledge and experience is going to be crucial, because the media now is acting as a destructive force amidst all of this violence and conflict that's going on around.
Thank you very much, Mahazam. To you, knowledge, experience, what else would the future require from your perspective?
I think that if I just go back to the challenge in some ways that we're facing throughout the region, there is the challenge of poverty, of lack of education, a young population that's unemployed. And I really think that we need to create and to understand that there is a direct correlation between the regimes in power in dictatorships and the results that we face today, the severe results of poverty and lack of education, bad health services. The regimes are responsible for this. And the people increasingly are moving against this. They have known this, but they are moving against it. The West should not be enabling these regimes to survive any longer. We know they will. We know they will support them to the last minute. But what we are saying is that the issue of security and stability in the region is very closely tied with regimes that are accountable, that allow for participation and respect the rule of law and human rights. We don't have that across the region. And until we have that, the West and our Western partners will not be able to have security and stability. They will have to change their mode of functioning. They need to rethink where their interests lie. But we need a fairer relationship with the West. and democracies can provide a fairer and more stable relationship than the situation that exists now.
As you say, deficiency of freedom, democracy, accountability. To you, Mr. Yilmaz, your final thoughts on this. Obviously, the stakes are very high for Turkey, for the entire region. To what extent will Syria, and beyond Syria, to what extent will it seal the fate, not just of the party in power here in Turkey, but of the governments within the region?
Actually, we, of course, focus our attention to the short-term and very hot events, but we should also simultaneously have some medium and long-term view about our region. And when I look at the medium and long-term, I see a need for reconciliation and reconstruction. Reconstruction of not just physical infrastructure, but institutions, states that are serving to their people rather than dictating certain things to the people. Markets that work with private sector and spirit of entrepreneurship. Civil society with different ideas and culture of tolerance. We need to consider about this next stage, and we should, of course, on the one hand, work to resolve the hot spots, hot conflicts, but at the same time, we should also prepare ourselves for medium and long term, in which we need this institution building, and we need to have more democratic societies that will serve and satisfy the expectations of the people.
Thank you very much indeed. No quick fixes. To you, Mr. Abu Sharour, what does the future look like, and what is the priority, would you say, in a word or two?
I think the future first. I think the Battle of Tripoli will end in the defeat of Khalifa Haftar. And I think the Libyan people will realize, and they are realizing that the issue is theirs, and they have to resolve this, they have to come together. And I think the international community also shifting in that direction to be able to support a far more peaceful solution in Libya than it is. And I believe that the Arab Springs, which did not end, by the way, because we've seen it resurged again, this had changed the area, have realized people that they have the power in their hands, and they are not going to go back.
No shortage of challenges, obviously, around the region, but a hopeful tone of cautious optimism, I think, that most panelists here share today. Let me thank you all very much for joining us and for these wonderful insights that you provided, and let me thank everyone here as well for being with us. Thank you all very much.